In today's lecture, we're going to focus on the endocrine system. Whenever we talk about the endocrine system, we want to always note that it interacts very closely with something called the nervous system, which we've talked about already. And one thing we want to note when we talk about this is that the endocrine system is a system that really acts very slowly, whereas the nervous system is one that is very fast, both in terms of its response time and in terms of its duration, right? So nervous system, skeletal muscle contracts and is done. Endocrine system, the release of hormones are very slow, and then that effect takes some time to dissipate. And the results of that release are also pretty slow. So you really want to associate these words with each of these systems respectively. Today we're going to talk about the organs of the endocrine system. And whenever we talk about endocrine, we're saying something released into the bloodstream. Remember, endocrine function is different than exocrine. Exocrine means that we have a duct, whereas endocrine means that we're talking about a ductless gland. And then finally, obviously, if someone studies the endocrine system, if you have a physician that does so, they study the field of endocrinology. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So what organs are involved in the endocrine system? Well, we have something called the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal glands and the hypothalamus, the thymus, the pancreas, and the gonads. All of these are different structures that are involved in the endocrine system, and we're going to focus on a few of these throughout our talk today. Other organs that contain some endocrine cells are the heart, digestive tract, kidneys, and skin, but these are not things that we're going to focus on greatly today. Rather, we're going to refer to this diagram on the right. Okay, so whenever we talk about the endocrine system, we're really focusing on the release of different hormones. And so we want to talk about what are hormones for a second, and then maybe the different classes of hormones. So when we talk about hormones, there's different hormones. Some are amino acid based, some are steroid based, and if they're steroid, it means they're derived from cholesterol. And there's always basic hormone action, right? They're released into the bloodstream, they circulate throughout the bloodstream, and then really what they're doing is they're targeting certain cells. Cells that have receptors on their surface or inside the cell, if it's a lipid-based hormone, and those receptors bind the hormone. We want to note too that hormones can have different effects on different target cells. So not all cells respond in the exact same way to the same hormone. Okay, whenever we talk about secretion, we're talking about three main types of stimuli. So the first is something called humoral. This is the very simplest form of endocrine control. And in this situation, what's happening is the secretion is being released in response to some simple blood parameters. So for example, changing in the ionic levels or nutrient levels in the blood, things of that nature. Another example could be parathyroid monitors calcium, right, in response to that. So really we're talking about sort of chemical or nutrient levels in the blood. That's humoral. The second category that we're talking about is neural. And here we're saying that there is a nervous system response. The nervous system is basically indicating the body or a certain organ should release hormones. And then the third is hormonal, which sounds a bit odd, right? We're saying hormonal causes the release of hormones, and we're just simply saying that, yeah, obviously something had to start that release of that first hormone, but after that, a given hormone can actually cause release of a secondary hormone. And this is an example that you see on the bottom. Okay, so now we talked about hormones. Let's talk about the specific glands of the endocrine system. And let's begin our discussion with the pituitary gland. So what does it do? Well, the pituitary gland is something that we consider the master gland, right? So it's very, 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 very important. And why do we call it the master gland? Well, we call it that because it secretes 9 major hormones. It's attached to the hypothalamus through something called the infundibulum. And there's 2 basic divisions of the pituitary. There's the anterior lobe in the front, right, and the posterior lobe in the back. Since the pituitary is the master gland, the next 3 or 4 slides are going to focus on it entirely. So just keep in mind that as we go through these charts, we have not left the pituitary gland yet. So let's go ahead and go through some of these hormones here. And the first few slides are going to focus on the anterior lobe, right, the hormones that are released from that lobe. Each hormone, we're going to talk about the hormone itself, what it is, then what organ does it target and what are its effects, and then lastly, we're going to talk about what happens if that hormone goes awry. In other words, if there's hyposecretion, too little of that hormone, or hypersecretion, too much of that hormone. Okay, so let's get started. So the first hormone that's released by the anterior pituitary gland that we're going to talk about is something called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And what does this do? This is released from the pituitary and it stimulates the thyroid itself, right, to release hormones. So it's stimulating another organ to release hormones. If you have too little of this in children, creatinism results, And if you have too much in adults, you have something called myxedema. If you have too little of those, or creatinism and myxedema. If you have too much of this hormone being released, it's a hyperthyroidism, right? And that can result in something called Graves' disease. And we've seen that in lab, and you're actually going to see that in lecture later on as well, where someone has their eyeballs with that bulging out effect. That's a very classic sign of Graves' disease. They also might have a lot of nervousness or increased heart rate. Okay, the second hormone we're going to talk about is something called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. And this one here, what does it? So it's released by the anterior pituitary. Remember, all these are on these charts. But here, where does it target? It targets the adrenal cortex, and it causes the release of other substances, glucocorticoids and androgens. If you have too little of it, it doesn't really happen, but too much of it causes something called Cushing's disease that we'll discuss later. Okay, let's continue. Again, still talking about the anterior pituitary gland. The third hormone we're going to talk about is something called follicle-stimulating hormone. And what this is, what does it target? Well, it targets the ovaries and the testes. In females, it stimulates ovarian follicle maturation, right, estrogen production. And in males, what it does is it stimulates sperm production. If you have too little of this hormone, you're going to have a fail of sexual maturity. Too much of it, we don't notice too many effects, really. Okay, let's go on to number 4 here. So number 4 is going to be luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone, again, is targeting these sex organs. So the ovaries and testes, right? In females, it triggers ovulation, which is very important. And in males, it promotes testosterone production. Okay, let's continue a bit further here. So now we're still on the anterior pituitary. Let's go on to number 5. Number 5 is GH, or something called growth hormone. What does this target? Like everything, right? Because as it suggests, is dealing with growth. So pretty much everything on that chart it targets. And what happens if you have too little of this in children? You're going to have dwarfism, right? The children are going to be too small. They're not going to mature as much as they should. If you have too much of it, you have something called gigantism. And in children, where they get too big, someone like Andre the Giant, an old wrestler from the 80s, suffered from that. A lot of basketball players, once you get above 7 feet, it's a high probability that this is what's happening. In adults, what happens, once someone's grown, if then they experience this high level of growth hormone, they have something called acromegaly, that results. And what this is since they can't really grow anymore in height, right, because their growth plates are shut, their face begins to grow, and other parts of their body begin to grow, not really in height, but more just in size. And so you'll see people with faces that are sort of misproportioned because it looks like they have just these super strong forehead projections or like jaw projections, things of that nature. Okay, if we go on to number 6 here, what else is secreted by the anterior pituitary? Something called prolactin. And this is a very common one that promotes lactation in women once they've had children. If they have too little of it, they have poor milk production. If they have too much of it, they're going to have too much milk production. Okay, now we're turning to the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So I just want to mention that, right? We're going to the posterior lobe. And there's 2 hormones we want to talk about here that are released. Okay, so one is called ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And what this does is it stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb water. If you have too little of this, you'll have something called diabetes insipidus. And if you have too much of it, basically you'll have a syndrome where you have inappropriate ADH secretion, it's called. Another hormone that's released by the posterior pituitary is something called oxytocin. And what this does is it stimulates uterine contractions during labor. That's sort of the key thing that we know. And there really are no, at least no known abnormalities that occur if this hormone is, at too high or too low of a level. It doesn't really happen that often. Okay, so now we're done with the pituitary. So keep in mind all those charts were the anterior pituitary, then the posterior pituitary. Okay, let's talk about the next endocrine gland, the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is this one that sort of forms this like V structure at your neck area. Okay, so what is it? It's the largely purely endocrine gland, right, where that's all it does. It's composed of a lot of follicles, areolar connective tissue, and there's 2 main hormones that it produces, something called thyroid hormone and something called calcitonin. If we look at these and say, what do they do? We'll notice that cells within the thyroid called parafollicular cells secrete calcitonin. What does that do? It lowers the blood calcium levels. We also have follicular cells within the thyroid that secrete thyroid hormone. And what this does is it has a role in metabolism. Okay, let's move on now. If we look at the back of the thyroid, we'll see glands called the parathyroid. So you could see them here, but they're sort of like showing through the thyroid. It's just an animation. If the thyroid was really, non-transparent, how it really is in real life, you would not see these parathyroid glands right here, these little spheres. But the artist is, taking a little leniency in terms of showing you those parathyroid glands, those little spheres on the thyroid. But really, you only see them from the backside. Okay, and that's what this first point is telling you. Now, there's two types of endocrine cells here. There's chief cells that produce parathyroid hormone, and what that does is that increases blood calcium level. Then there's cells called oxyphil cells, where the function we don't quite understand yet. Okay, what does the parathyroid gland do? Well, really what it does is it does those things we mentioned before, right? But I wanted to show you this slide because I wanted to show you sort of a nice view here. You're looking at the back of someone's neck. You could see this V-structured thyroid organ, right? The one that was on the anterior side. Now it's sort of divided by the esophagus. We can't see both. It looks like two structures, but it's one, right? Because we're seeing it from the posterior side. But now we're truly seeing the parathyroid gland, the one we're talking about right now. We see these little spheres here, right? So these are parathyroid glands. Just want to emphasize here that you see it from the posterior end, right? As you can see on the bottom here from the posterior end. And this is just a nice microscope image of the the parathyroid, showing some of the different cells that are involved. Okay, so let's move on to the adrenal gland. And what does this do? So these adrenal glands are located just superior to the kidneys, and you can see them right there. And really what they do is they have the adrenal medulla, right, which is a cluster of neurons derived from the neural crest, and it's basically part of the sympathetic nervous system. That's the medulla. And then you have the adrenal cortex, and that forms the bulk of the gland, and that's derived from somatic mesoderm. Basically, whenever we think adrenal glands, really what we're thinking is hormones that are released to help someone cope with stress, right? Danger, terror, or any type of stress you could imagine. So really, again, what's the main function? When our sympathetic nervous system is activated, when we see a bear, or we have that huge exam coming up, which hopefully this doesn't happen, but your sympathetic nervous system would be activated. Okay, let's go back up to the pineal gland up here. Okay, so we have this pineal gland way at the top here. What does this do? Well, it's a small pine cone-shaped gland, right? It's located on the roof of the diencephalon, so this is inside the brain here. And really, it's a neat structure where you have this sort of pineal sand, we call it, where if someone takes an X-ray, you can really see the pineal gland. It stands out as this like sand-like structure. So it helps physicians locate other structures in the brain, given that the pineal gland shows up very nicely in an X-ray. What does it do? The cells in the pineal gland, what they do is they secrete something called melatonin. And what melatonin is, it's a hormone that regulates circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are your sleep patterns, so making sure that you're on the correct sleep cycle. Okay, let's move on to the pancreas, and this is a biggie with the endocrine system. So pancreas is one we really want to focus on, and it's this structure I'm highlighting in red right here. Okay, so why is it so important? Well, the first reason it's important is that it has two different categories of function. It has endocrine function, where it's releasing hormones into the bloodstream, like we talked about on that first slide, but it also has exocrine function, where it's giving secretions into the digestive system through ducts. So we want to make sure we realize, if you ever get it on an MCAT test or on the nursing T's test, they say what organ of the endocrine system has both endo and exocrine functions. Key answer is the pancreas. It's a classic example. Okay, now let's return to the endocrine function of the pancreas. So there's two types of cells. There's alpha cells and there's beta cells. The alpha cells secrete glucagon, and what that does is it signals the liver to release glucose. So basically, if your blood sugar is too low, glucagon will be secreted to raise your blood sugar. The beta cells do the opposite. They secrete something called insulin. And when they're secreting insulin, what that does is it's telling your body to take up or use that sugar that's in your bloodstream, right? And store it in the liver in the form of glycogen for later use. So the net effect of that is that we lower our blood sugar when insulin is produced. You could see that these are very key hormones involved in someone, especially if they have diabetes, right? And these are hormones that have sort of gone awry. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, what does the thymus do? Let's focus on that. So the thymus is located in the lower neck, sort of in the anterior region of the thorax. It's a very important immune organ, right? And so really, why is this important? Well, What it does is the site at which T lymphocytes arise, from their precursor cells. And we've talked about this before, actually, when we talked about lymphatic system and immune system. There's different thymic hormones that are produced, right? But really beyond that, we're not going to focus on the thyroid too much in this lecture, but we just want to sort of remind ourselves about its important immune function. Okay, so what do the gonads do? Well, these are ones that are probably well known by everyone, right? So these are just involved in reproduction. These are your sex cells, or we'd say your germ cells. Remember, gonads, the ovaries and the testes, are producing gametes that are haploid. In other words, your sperm and egg are the gametes, right? And they're haploid. They have one of each numbered chromosome, whereas all the other cells in your body have two of each numbered chromosome. So it's very important to note that. Okay, so what happens? Well, they're the main source of the sex hormones. So the testes and the ovaries, that's where they come from. In males, what happens is some cells called interstitial cells secrete androgens. Primary one is testosterone, and it promotes the formation of sperm, as well as many secondary sex characteristics in a male. So the primary sex characteristic of a male would be the fact that he has testicles. But secondary sex characteristics would be things like a large amount of facial hair, a deep voice, broad shoulders, things of that nature. Okay, in females, females have the ovaries, right? And the androgens that are secreted there are secreted by the theca folliculi. And basically what happens is we're releasing estrogen, right? The secondary sex characteristics in females. So the promotion of secondary sex characteristics in females are things like enlarged breasts, wide waist, things of that nature. Remember, their primary sex characteristic would be the fact that they have ovaries. And then there's also the release of progesterone, and this prepares the uterus for pregnancy. And we'll talk about that in much more detail later on in our lectures on reproduction. Okay, now that we've talked about some of the main organs and structures in the endocrine system, let's focus on some disorders of the endocrine system. And let's first focus on the pituitary disorders. And some of these we mentioned before, but some we might not have, so I just want to refresh our memory on these. Okay, so whenever you have gigantism, remember, very, very tall basketball player, over 7 foot, or big wrestler, those are classic examples we think of. That's hypersecretion of this growth hormone in children. If it's in adults, it doesn't have quite the same effect, but we have that effect where we get large facial structures, right? So adults can't grow in height anymore if that's the first time they experience increase in GH, but their bones can sort of like get thicker, right? Okay, too little, you have dwarfism. Right? If it's hyposecretion, you have dwarfism. And then obviously some forms of diabetes can result from this as well. This is really not the classic form of diabetes though, but it is one form. If we talk about disorders of the pancreas, now we focus on the classic diabetes that we're used to talking about. So there's two types of diabetes. Type 1 is really the genetic kind, right? That's the kind where we have insufficient secretion of insulin. Develops suddenly, but usually someone knows before they're 15. And really what's happening is these people cannot produce insulin at all, right? And it's a very common disease and disorder. Fortunately nowadays, with medication and with proper diet, exercise, individuals can really reduce the symptoms of this disease. Okay, type 2 diabetes is something that, again, there's always a genetic component. Certain people are more prone to it than others, but there's a larger environmental role here. So type 2 is where we have sort of the environment taking play a bit more. So this is sort of late onset diabetes or adult onset. It usually occurs much later, like after the age of 40. What happens is cells, due to genetics, overconsumption of sugar, other factors, the cells have a lower sensitivity to insulin. You can try to control it by diet and exercise, but again, eventually, as this disease progresses, most people have to be put on insulin, other types of medication. Okay, there's also disorders of the thyroid gland, and a very classic one is something called Graves' disease, a form of hyperthyroidism. And this is basically when we have an oversecretion of thyroid hormone by the follicle cells. And what happens is the main symptom is this protrusion of the eyeballs, right? So you get this very large protrusion of the eyeballs with blood vessels prominent, and that's the major symptom, the major symptom of Graves' disease. Also, though, given that we have too much thyroid hormone, these individuals might experience sort of anxiety or sweating, rapid heartbeat, and weight loss. Those are sort of secondary symptoms. Okay. There's also something called myxedema. And this is a type of hypothyroidism in adults. And what this does is antibodies attack and destroy the thyroid tissue. And really what happens is sort of the opposite of Graves' disease in a sense, right? So we have low metabolic rate, things slow down, and these individuals tend to gain weight. And there's other symptoms as well. Okay, other types of disorders that we could have of the thyroid. If someone has a lack of iodine in their diet, they can develop something called an endemic goiter. And what this is it's a protrusion of the thyroid hormone, the thyroid itself, the thyroid gland in the neck, where it starts to enlarge, starts to swell, and you can see it very easily in someone's neck. It's very pronounced. You can also have creatinism, which results from hypothyroidism, and this happens in children. And so when you have creatinism, what happens is these individuals are usually very short. The proportions of their body are not what you expect them to be, a bit deformed in that manner. And there is mental retardation that occurs with this as well. Okay, there's also disorders of the adrenal cortex, and so here's a few to mention here. And these take a while to take effect, so someone doesn't notice this until later in their adulthood. But if someone has Cushing's syndrome, this is caused by a hypersecretion of one of those adrenal cortex hormones, something called glucocorticoid. And really what happens is that you'll notice that this is sort of before someone is affected by it, but later in life when they're affected, there's certain structures that really sort of result here. So the individual's face will get sort of puffy, and also they'll develop, they call it a buffalo hump in the back of their neck. Now that buffalo hump can obviously be, occur because of poor posture as well, but this disease sort of accentuates that symptom. Okay. There's something else called Addison's disease, and this is hyposecretion of one of the adrenal cortex hormones. And this results in deficiencies in both the mineral corticoids as well as the glucocorticoids. Okay, so that's a nice discussion on the endocrine system. And just to summarize again, when we talk about endocrine system, we're talking about very, very slow, right? Very, very slow release of hormones into the bloodstream. And the effects take a while to take effect, and they can occur over a long period of time. Whereas the nervous system, sort of its complementary system, this happens very fast, right? Your skeletal muscles contract very fast, and then once they contract, they're done. It's something that happens very, very quickly. So we really want to think of the endocrine system and the nervous system as a pair, if you will, but they act in very, very different manners. That's a big take-home thing to mention. Okay, remember, whenever we say endocrine, we're talking about release of hormones into the bloodstream. If we talk about exocrine, then we're talking about release of secretions into ducts. So the endocrine system is ductless, right? There are no ducts in that. Also, whenever we think endocrine, we think hormones. And then finally, a doctor that studies the endocrine system, or a physician in that area, is called an endocrinologist because they're studying endocrinology. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. As always, make sure that you understand each of the terms we talked about and before you proceed to the next lecture.